In the midst of Bomber Command's first year of war, we find Pilot Officer Leonard Cheshire, a talented yet inexperienced pilot who was familiar with a mix of war's terror and the peaceful breaks that interrupted the fighting. During one of these calm periods, amidst the chaos, Destiny, also known as a Beano, arranged a meeting with a mysterious woman. In terms of shenanigans, what comes next has everything else in this pilot's career beaked. It's also an amazing window into the lives, many of them short, that the men of Bomber Command lived. My question is, based on the information I'm about to share, would you have been able to predict that Leonard Cheshire would become one of only 32 airmen to receive the Victoria Cross in World War II? My source is a book, a raw, unfiltered dive into Leonard Cheshire's thoughts during the war. It's not about the grandeur of battles, but a deep dive into the mind of a pilot, crafted from his notes and diaries. And through the words, you get a real sense of a young man getting to grips with the new situation he finds himself in. We meet his first crew, introduced slowly, starting with the most memorable member, Skipper Hugh Lofty Long, then moving on to others like Percy the Navigator, and then the NCOs such as Axtell, the rear gunner. This isn't a comprehensive war account, it's a wartime piece, so it's missing the nitty-gritty details. I had to dig deep into primary sources to get the full picture. From the book alone, you might think Cheshire became a crew captain overnight, but the reality, his journey was a gradual climb covering 18 sorties of his first operational tour, nearly all under Lofty's watchful eye. Soon, however, young Cheddar was deemed a little better than useless by the big New Zealander and given the boot as his second pilot. On August the 10th, 1940, Cheshire is leading his first command on a sortie to Frankfurt. They hit the target, but it's not clear how effective they were. Nonetheless, it's a huge milestone in his career. He's now one sortie closer to finishing his first operational tour. The following evening, Cheshire and a fellow pilot from 102 Squadron, referred to unhelpfully as Jimmy in his notes, headed 26 miles up the north coast for a night out. Given their base at Driftfield, they likely ended up in Scarborough. If you've tried to sleep one off by the pavilion, then you have something in common with Cheddar Cheshire. Jimmy, when you understand the RAF dubbing culture, is no mystery. He's Pilot Officer R. James, a fellow pilot who'd been with Cheshire since the beginning at the squadron. Indeed, they had started operations within 2 weeks of each other, Cheshire on the 6th of June 1940 and James on the 18th. Cheshire also mentions that James was frustrated over missing the first RAF raid on Italy back on the 11th to 12th of June. Then he was left on the ground due to a dud Whitley during the Milan raid later in August. So with that digging into the records, it became clear who Cheshire's co-conspirator was in this account found in the book.
Last night, one of the most surprising nights I've ever spent. Jimmy and I hitched ourselves a lift up to town, 26 miles up the coast. The sun was hot and the sand sparkling, and the sea looked warm even if it was not, so we bathed.
He goes on to say,
For the first hour and a half, not much to report. A round of the bars and Jimmy talking at the top of his voice about women's hairstyles, but no promise of any developments. At the fourth port of call, the outlook was better, tinkling glasses and jewellery and laughter. Jimmy's eyes brightened and his step became jaunty. Needless to say, he settled himself down beside the most gorgeous girl in the room, and from then on appeared to have forgotten my presence completely.
It was clear how Jimmy wanted to unwind and forget the war. Next, Cheshire describes how he ended up nearly being shot by his own side.
At midnight, the gaming began to grow animated, and I left. Outside, there was a wonderful smell of salt, so I set out for the beaches. The district was unfamiliar, rows and rows of dirty-looking houses, and no one to ask the way. I must have walked in many circles. At last I saw the sea, but between it and me barbed wire entanglements, so it was some time before I managed to break through. When I eventually reached the shore, it was well worth the effort and a torn tunic. Sea and moon and the quiet splash of breakers. I wandered slowly up and down with my hands in my pockets, thinking I had the laugh on Jimmy after all, but unfortunately not for very long. Dimly I heard a heavy step behind me and then,
Halt! Who goes there?
Friend.
Advance and be recognized.
I advanced cautiously. The bayonet looked menacing.
What's the password?
Don't know.
Have you your permit?
No. I've my RAF pass, though.
Does it permit you in a defended area?
I don't think so. I didn't know this was a defended area.
In that case, you'll have to accompany me to headquarters.
And so we marched along, I in front with my hands in the air, and he behind with a bayonet sticking into my back. I hope that gun's not loaded.
Well, you hope wrong.
At least it's not cocked.
Yes, it is. And the safety catch is off, and I've got my finger on the trigger. But you needn't worry. I haven't taken up the slack on the first pull yet.
Well, that's nice to know anyway. I think he was an Australian. The officer in charge was no less menacing, but in the end, he broke down. I was given a drink of rum and politely ushered out of the defences.
By this point, Cheshire had found himself in a situation familiar to most of us, at the end of a good night out with no way to get home.
The time was 2:30 Sunday morning, and no trains till 10:30. In fact, the station was locked up. No buses either, and no Jimmy, and 9 o'clock duty at camp. I tried sleeping on the grass outside the pavilion, but it was too cold. I climbed the station gates and went to sleep in a first-class railway coach, wondering where it was bound for if it should happen to move off. 4:30 found me walking the southbound highway to camp. Town was some 5 miles behind. I had been lucky and got 2 lifts so far, but there was still a long way to go. The morning was gorgeous, just as the night had been. I did not mind walking in the least. In fact, come to that, I did not mind whether I arrived back in time or not. If you are in the process of enjoying something, there is no point in spoiling it by worrying. At least, that is the way I figure it out. 5:30 found me still walking. Felix the cat had done the same thing once upon a time, but nonetheless it was quite amusing. In the distance there was something parked by the roadside. I began speculating on what it was. As I came closer, I saw it was a car, and a pretty smart-looking car at that. Imperceptibly, my pace quickened. A chance of a lift, and I was afraid lest it should move off before I reached it. At least there was somebody in it, because they were blowing the horn as though they were in a London jam. Only 100 yards to go, and I was walking fast. Then suddenly I came to a dead stop. I do not think I have ever seen such a beautiful girl, and it wasn't because I was not prepared for it. What was more, she drove me all the way to camp in a beautiful delage. She had flaming red hair. When I asked her to have dinner with me, she did not refuse. Quite like a storybook. Up here amongst the moon and these fleecy clouds, I can hardly believe it happened. I must cross-examine Jimmy closely in the morning.
You can really imagine the scene of a young man, though in charge of a mighty war machine, letting his mind wander and dwelling on more enjoyable tasks. Unfortunately for young Leonard, due to the demands of the raid on Milan on the 13th and 14th of August 1940, he never made it to that dinner. But what had gone wrong? Surely one-off operations, as the ORB clearly shows Cheshire could be for nights on a trot, he should have been able to get off base. Bombing Italy was no small feat. In fact, a special force was created to achieve this in June 1940, which I plan to cover in a dedicated video on my channel. The Whitley squadrons, based in the north of England, didn't have the range to achieve this assignment with a great degree of safety. So 102 Squadron found themselves operating from RAF Harwell. This was a forward airbase that, rather conveniently, slashed the grueling journey to Milan to a more palatable 1,200-mile round trip. It would not be an easy operation, and the results were mixed. Frankly, Cheshire and his crew were lucky to get back to Harwell. Mechanical gremlins, the bane of any pilot's existence, ensured their delayed return to Driftfield into a day after the raid. It was the 15th of August 1940, a date stamped in the annals of Battle of Britain history, not for a triumphant homecoming, but for a raid on their own turf. Just as Cheshire's Whitley touched down, the ominous drone of enemy bombers echoed in the skies. Driftfield was now the target, part of a mass attack by Luftwaffe 5. In the ensuing 9 days, with no sorties penciled in, Cheshire was anything but idle. He goes on to describe one of the most deviously brilliant escapades a young man in wartime could engage in. He says,
The Germans were not the only ones who provided diversion during those 10 days. I called on the local police and asked for the red-haired owner of a Delage car, number BFX 102. They were very nice, but told me to go to hell. This gave cause for violent thought, but after delving into every conceivable possibility, it was obvious there was nothing else for it. I went to town and made a statement charging the driver of the Delage, number BFX 102, with dangerous driving in the early hours of last Friday morning. In point of fact, it was not very far off the truth. The effect was dynamic.
It seems an incredible method to blag a dinner with some girl you just met, but when you regard these actions within the wider scope of Cheshire's day-to-day existence at the time, why the hell wouldn't you?
We met in a small room in the police station, and I found out quite a number of interesting details. Her name, Maxine, and of no fixed abode. After a pleasant exchange of formalities, which left the sergeant visibly shaken, my statement was read out. It was a good story, simple but effective, about walking peacefully along a deserted country road, a sudden death-defying roar, and a sudden but timely leap to safety among the nettles. It was effective because the outcome was simple. A quiet, friendly argument to start with, a tender apology from Maxine, accompanied by an explanation of the vigorous refreshment inspired by early dawn. A pleased acknowledgement by the sergeant of the broad-mindedness and understanding of youth, interspersed, of course, by a few disparaging remarks on the dangers of fast driving and withdrawing of the charge. Yes, the plan was brilliantly conceived and brilliantly executed.
Incredibly, he'd managed to get one over bumbling PC Plod and to catch this girl's eye.
But there was one factor I had overlooked. The sergeant had no sooner smacked his lips on the final word of my statement than Maxine said,
"How did you manage to get my number?"
"As you were disappearing into the distance, of course, got good eyesight."
"Well, that's remarkable. I haven't had a rear plate for 3 weeks.
If the sergeant was shaken before, he was electrocuted now. The bored look had gone, and in its place was, I thought, a slight air of triumph. As he worked hard over his pencil, he was breathing deeply, and then every now and then grunting. Maxine smiled demurely and said something about meaning to report it for some time, but not quite having the courage to face the police. The sergeant looked pleased and said,
"We're not so terrible. Not if you don't do anything you shouldn't."
Then, after hours of writing and taking of evidence and signing, he went out to look at the car. Of course, there was no number plate. I could have sworn there had been one last Friday, but it was too late now. I had given myself away long ago. The sergeant leaned across to Maxine and spoke in a very confidential voice.
"Has this young man been molesting you?"
No more than the others, really. I think I've seen him around once or twice, but I haven't taken much notice of him."
This seemed to be just what the sergeant wanted. He grunted a while to himself, stroked his jaw, and after a suitable pause threatened me with various charges, such as obstructing the police in the course of their duty and malicious prosecution, until finally I escaped. Maxine said,
"Of course you want to live, don't you?"
"Yes, please."
"Well, it's going to be fun, watching you talk your way out of this frame-up, so I don't mind helping you, just this once."
The tale, as enthralling as it is, has been given that extra polish for the press, a dash of dramatic flair. But let's not be cynical, for amidst the embellishments, the raw, unvarnished truth of war pulsates. In the dark skies over Europe, Bomber Command was a theatre of heroism and horror, where men like Cheshire and his crew danced on the knife edge of mortality. Life at a frontline bomber station was a maddening oscillation between the visceral thrill and fear of action and the languid days of waiting, where the yawning abyss of boredom was as formidable an adversary as the enemy flak or fighters. Every moment was precious, every heartbeat a luxury, in a world where tomorrow was but a promise. Now, when it comes to Cheshire and the enigmatic Maxine, the book is as silent as a foggy night over the channel. Remember, it's Cheshire, not Chatterley. For the young pilot officer, the war pushed on. Days after trying to use the long arm of the law to give a girl a prod, he was back in action. He conducted a successful raid on Stuttgart on the 28th of August 1940. Convoy escort patrols in his Whitley then occupied Cheshire's days between the 9th of September and the 5th of October, a period where he conducted 9 such operations. So far, he had survived 31 sorties with 102 Squadron, 12 of them as skipper. The 17th of October saw them painting the skies red over Leunen, and Dortmund also felt the wrath of Cheshire that night, with one stick being dropped on the city. Merseburg was an elusive target, evading his crew on the night of the 7th of November, and a railway junction at Pretscher bore the brunt of their attack. 3 days later, Ruhrland was successfully hit. 34 sorties without a scratch. Something had to give. And on the night of the 12th of November, en route to Wesseling, fate, capricious and cruel, cast its icy gaze upon Cheshire's crate. While still miles from their target, Whitley, DYN, was hit twice. During the barrage from the flak below, his WOP was grievously wounded. It was imperative to get out of the area as soon as possible, and so Cologne received their jettison payload. Every sinew strained. Over the next few hours, they limped back home. A victory, but at a cost. It was his 35th operation, the 16th with Cheshire at the helm. A respite was not just desired, it was earned. Despite all that he had faced, it was clear what Cheshire most wanted to achieve during this time away from the battle.
Leave. The first of the year, therefore the best. I met Maxine at the Mayfair. Her red hair sparkled, her mauve eyes glistened, and her quick smile was quicker than ever. We drank, and then we danced, and then we drank some more. Alf, behind the bar, was at his best. The Blitz was at its height. London was exciting, yet somehow it was not excitement that I wanted. Anyway, Maxine was to be married.
Without knowing more about what happened between Cheshire and the vivacious Maxine over the preceding 3 months, it's hard to know how much this news affected the young airman. Likely it was a bitter disappointment, even if the romance had yet to really get off the ground. He reports in his book,
I packed my bags and went home to Oxford. Oxford, in spite of its throngs of wealthy evacuees and silken-haired playboys, was peaceful and quiet. I changed into grey flannels and an open shirt and wandered slowly through the streets, my hands in my pockets. An old lady stopped me and said,
Is there anything the matter with you, my boy?
Yes, I said. I've a broken heart.
Well, I never. That's no reason for an able-bodied young man like you not to be in uniform.
And so, thinking of nothing to say, I passed along.
It gives me a smile to think that perhaps years later that little old lady saw a big photograph of Leonard Cheshire in the paper and said, I made him do that. Ignorance is bliss. For me, this little story of romance, the thing we all hate to see in our favourite war movies, really does bring the human side of war into acute focus. It's only by looking at the original sources that you can truly understand this tale, which would be most at home in the locker room. The same audacity that saw Cheshire bringing a woman into the police station on a charge, for a date no less, was the same that saw him awarded a Victoria Cross. The man had guts. So what do you think? Please let me know in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video and you'd like to spread the word about this episode of Leonard Cheshire's war story, please give it a like. I really appreciate your support. And before you dash off, why not check out the next video on screen for you right now? It's a good one.